everyone to Next Gen Talks, the future of policing. This is a video podcast series hosted by the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is going to be called Is Change Possible? Community-Led Changemakers in Action. We're going to be talking about community-led programs and initiatives that serve as solutions to some of the highly debated policing issues of today. Two of the programs, alternatives to policing over policing, we're going to be talking about today are the 5 Days Without Police experiment in Brooklyn, New York, and the MET program in Los Angeles. My name is James Combs, and I'm the host for this conversation today. I'm here in Akron, Ohio, and I'm currently a student at the University of Akron. So some of the program examples and alternatives, one we're going to talk about is called the 5 Days Without Police experiment in Brooklyn, New York, and the other is the MET program in Los Angeles. So Dana Racklin, who I'm with, is the co-founder of We Build the Block, and she's going to be heading up the conversation about the 5 Days Without Police experiment. And I'm also joined by Annika Simpson, who is a mental health counselor and registered nurse with the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, who's going to talk to us about the MET program. So, Dana, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the 5 Days Without Cop experiment in Brooklyn, New York?
Sure. Thank you for having me. As you said, I represent a campaign called We Build the Block, and this campaign was specifically put together for young people to organize. Our young people, they're called Crew Count. I'm wearing them here to organize and engage various communities in the public safety conversation, with a real goal of getting everybody to think about public safety as needing to be community-led and community implemented. And so our approach is the organizing, then piloting new policies and protocols, and then using the outcomes of those policies and protocols to influence the public safety debate here in New York City and nationally. So one of the things that we have recently piloted, which we did the technical assistance on, was this. It's actually called the Brownsville Safety Alliance, but it kind of went viral as 5 Days No Cops because of how it was written up in the press. So the Brownsville Safety Alliance, for those who are not familiar with New York City or Brownsville specifically, Brownsville has the highest density of NYCHA housing, public housing. It has violent crime disproportionate to the population in the rest of New York City, and chronic quality of life issues. So the way that that's described here in New York City is, houselessness, drug addiction, all these types of things that would maybe make somebody want to call the police. And this has been prevalent for decades. And the response by the police department or our city, is to deploy the police department, as though criminal solutions to social problems would be effective. And that's why things continue to be the way that they are. So we work with a really progressive commander in Brownsville. His name is Deputy Inspector Terrell Anderson. And a bunch of the people in the community had gone to him and said, having cops just stationed here makes us feel like they're overseers on a horse. And, the imagery of that Brownsville is a predominantly Black neighborhood. And the imagery of that and the feelings that it elicit, I'm sure everybody can think about that. And so he is from Brownsville. He was born in Brownsville, raised there, lives close by still. He has a sense of duty to serve and protect in a way that maybe is non-traditional. He sees himself differently in that role. And he said, I really want to be responsive to this community. And in white communities, police departments are very, very responsive. That is how we police white communities. We're responsive to what white citizens want. And in Black communities and brown communities, it seems to be reactive, aggressive, and typical over policing. So he said, listen, if you want me to take these cops off the block, I understand why. But we also have to figure out what are we going to do to address the conditions that are on this block. And so the Alliance was born as a group of many groups of different service providers, city agencies, down to state and city agencies that have an obligation to do this work, right? It speaks to the larger issue around public safety. For example, there's a lot of trash in Brownsville piled up. why is Department of Sanitation not picking up trash regularly in this community? Like, that is part of their jobs and duties. And that contributes to the public safety conversation. So all of these agencies and service providers got together and they said, we're going to occupy the block, along with violence interrupters, who are credible messengers trained in the Cure Violence model, which believes that gun violence is a public health issue. It's an epidemic that needs to be treated like a health issue. So we had violence interrupters instead of police officers. We had service providers instead of police officers. And, I can report that there was no 911 calls and no incidents of violence. And so that was the pilot, and we did some data collection. And actually, I just got off of a call because we're going to do it again in April, hopefully bigger and better, until we can institutionalize this as the norm, right? Where the community can decide what are the resources that we need here, and how do we deploy those resources, and when do we deploy those resources to best serve the interests of our community and increase public safety.
Okay, yeah, definitely. So you said something super interesting I want to kind of go back to. You mentioned how that in white communities that the police departments are super responsive as to comparative where they're not in Black communities. What exactly does that mean? Is it the access, or is it the not listening to when they do get meetings, or what does that look like?
So I think a great example of this would be in the Jewish communities here in New York City. When they want to do a large wedding or a funeral for the Grand Rebbe or something like that, they or for Passover and other holidays where they're going to be in the streets doing rituals, they coordinate with the police department. And the police department says, okay, we're going to stand back because we understand these are your rituals, right? And this is what happens during this high holy day, or this is what happens when the Grand Rebbe passes away. And yet, if let's say somebody is unfortunately killed or dies in a Black neighborhood and they want to have a memorial, it's met with helicopters flying overhead, police officers in riot gear, overly aggressive and punitive enforcement. So it's this idea of how can we take the cultural norms of communities and be responsive to those norms and not infringe upon those norms and use enforcement and public safety as the excuse to do so. And communities know what will make them safe, and communities are the experts. Community members are the experts in their own communities. So having a police commander who is responsive to the community that they serve is really essential in driving down crime and increasing public safety, and also increasing officer safety. Because what we saw, again, another example would be when COVID-19 hit and we saw officers enforcing social distancing. Almost all of the arrests around social distancing happened in Black and brown communities. And it was these violent brawls that played out on TV and Instagram for not wearing a mask. Who's safe? The cop isn't safe. The community isn't safe. So really just thinking about what are the ways that we can transform how we think about public safety, elevate resources that go beyond violence interruption, like we're talking about food apartheid and health inequities and all of those things, really strengthening the foundation of communities, and then first and foremost being responsive. So I'm doing a lot of talking here, but in my role for the Brownsville Safety Alliance, we're background doing technical assistance, just helping put together surveys, deploying people to give out the surveys, and really supporting the partners and making sure that, they have what they need to do, what they are intending to do. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. What does that look like? How did that come about with you guys kind of connecting with the police commander? Was it a community written letter or a meeting at some kind of hall, or how did that go about?
I've been working in the justice system and with the police department for like 11 years now. And, at first I was this like kick down the door, I wanted to force things down people's throats kind of thing. And, you learn that you're not going to change certain people. A lot of people are not just financially invested in policing as the way that it is, but emotionally and logistically invested in it. And so Deputy Inspector Terrell Anderson has demonstrated, he of his own free will wanted to do something that would be revolutionary in his community. And he said that on the call that we just had. He said, we're starting a revolution about what it means to have community-led policing in communities that have never had agency in their own public safety.
Yeah. So let's talk about the results of the experiment, some of the outcomes that came out of it. Were you satisfied with how this ran and everything that came out of it?
Yeah, I think that the challenge is institutionalizing it, right? And making it not feel like an event, but making it feel like the norm, right? So again, it should be normal that, because for example, the thing that he did was he moved a foot post. That happens across New York City every single day with no attention at all. But because he moved a foot post in a neighborhood that is, accustomed, unfortunately, to being over policed, it becomes this, oh my God, like, is he crazy? He's taking this big risk. And, we have to really change that dynamic, and we have to stop talking about these things as being exceptional. And so how do we institutionalize it? And that's kind of where we're at now, is how do we get it to be a norm that without the coordination of all of these members at specific days and times, that they're just doing this stuff in these neighborhoods, just giving these resources to people that need and deserve them, that they're being paid to do that work. And that commanders don't have to be exceptional, right? That communities have commanders that respect them and want to work with them and are willing to take risks. And when I say risks, I mean risks to their professional advancement, not real risk as far as the community goes, because we know this is where the community wants them to be. It's whether the policing world supports such behaviors and actions.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the broader city of New York and what happens within it. I want to talk about what the New York City Police Department's response to this event was. Did they have takeaways from it? I remember reading the article that it mentioned there was an interview with their press department. That request was declined. So can you talk to me any bit about what their response to this program was?
I can't speak as to why they would decline to talk about the program. I will say that they, under the executive order of Governor Cuomo, they have to submit a reform plan to receive state funding. And they did put the Brownsville Safety Alliance into that reform plan. So it would signal that there is greater support to expand this beyond Brownsville. But I cannot speak to what NYPD leadership chooses to do with innovative ideas.
Okay, I understand that. So I want to talk about you a little more. What's your philosophy on the concept of urban policing? What does it look like in New York City? And does the general community want more cops or less cops on the streets?
So I think that people have to understand that New York City is a progressive city, but it's a progressive city in quotes. We're highly segregated. The wealth inequities, the wealth gap is huge. And so that question comes, it depends on who you ask and when you ask them that. If you ask a white person when they're marching in Union Square screaming Black Lives Matter during COVID quarantine, I'm sure they would say less. But when they're in the comfort of their high rise in a gentrifying neighborhood, and they see a houseless person under, infrastructure in their neighborhood, they want the option to call the police. And I think that over policing is a result of the real estate lobby and white liberals who are not willing to be accountable to their own racism and their part in oppression, and done so out of self-interest because they like where they live, they like their brunch spots. And we have to really start to have that conversation in a real way, because we are not progressive. It's smoke and mirrors, and we have to really talk about that. I would say that we do have a really high inflated police budget, and I think most people would agree, no matter the color or where you live, that budget is way too much. I mean, we're talking upwards of $6 billion.
Oh.
Ridiculous.
Okay, so let's talk about something that might not be as obviously the program ran well, and you mentioned how there weren't any reports of violence or no 911 calls within the period. What are some of the off-beaten trails or little things that you might not have predicted that you learned from this experiment? Is there anything that kind of surprised you guys?
No, I mean, I've been betting on communities for a long time. And, I know that when provided the space, right, and the opportunity to have real agency, we, as part of the work that we do at We Build the Block, we host block activations at night on blocks that have high incidence of gun violence. And we've never had a violent incident, and it's always been peace, love, and joy. And it's because we cultivate that. And I think that it's important that we focus on those positives and the real greatness, the human capital that we refuse to acknowledge in all of these communities is really special. So,
okay, I want to pivot. I wouldn't necessarily call this a criticism, but one of the concerns somebody raised regarding this program, I read that a criminal justice professor at Temple University mentioned that he wasn't sure how much was able to be learned from this program, because even though the patrolling officers were taken off that block, they might have been still patrolling the blocks that people used to get to the 2 blocks they were taken off of. How do you respond to that comment?
I respond to that the same way I respond to all the experts. Come outside. Come outside. It's the same way that I respond to candidates and elected officials, and quite honestly, white people who want to have a conversation about gun violence or public safety, and they've never been outside. They don't talk to the people that we're talking to. They don't interface with violence interrupters. And again, thinking about resource disparity, when you think about what that precinct, that command spends in overtime in just 1 quarter, is more than the entire budget of violence interrupters for a year. The disparity in infrastructure and budget is beyond. So instead of focusing on that, I wish that these experts would focus on why is there such a disparity in resources and infrastructure support that could actually, really generate some sustainable institutionalized change.
Right. Yeah. Talking about this program has really been great. I do want to ask though, what's the next steps for you guys? What's the future of this pilot program and some of the other programs you're involved in?
I think that we have a mayoral election coming up in 2021. In June is our primary, November is our final general election. And I think that what it is we are demonstrating defund in action. We are demonstrating that public safety can be community-led, and that communities know what's best for themselves, and that we need an influx of resources, intentional resources and investment in communities that have been intentionally divested in and intentionally over-policed. And so I think that the hope is that all the work that we're doing produces a real progressive agenda around public safety with our next mayor.
That's great. That's great. It's good to hear from you. So I want to pivot now to a program that we just heard from Dana speaking about a program that doesn't involve police, and now we're going to move to hearing about a program that does. We'll be talking about the MET program. This is a collaboration between cops and mental health workers who've been working in many cities in Los Angeles County. Annika, you want to lead us off and tell us about the MET program?
Yes, the MET program, which stands for Mental Evaluation Teams. The Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health started this program probably over 10 years ago, and they collaborate with law enforcement. So the goal is to have a MET team within every agency throughout Los Angeles County. And so what they do is they put a mental health clinician, as if myself, which is a registered nurse or a psychologist or a licensed clinical social worker or a licensed psych tech, and we ride around with an officer who's trained in the mental health field. And then we respond to calls from our patrol officers or from the community. So what happens is when our patrol officers come across a situation where they feel like this person may be mentally ill or may need an evaluation, they call us. So then we come out, and with the trained officer and myself, we evaluate the client. And if it is a mental illness, then we find resources for the client, hospitalize the client if need be, make sure the client is safe. That works well with us because a lot of times we also have what's called a PMRT team, which is called a psychiatric mobile response team which is just based with clinicians. And so what happens is if they get a call, and even before they go out without law enforcement, they have to assess the call and triage the call. So questions are asked like, do this person have a gun in the home? Do this person have a history of aggression or stuff like that? So if they feel like it's unsafe, then they'll call the local law enforcement agency in that city to kind of meet them out there and stand by. So it works well for us because the officers are trained, and we do, trainings for all of our agencies as far as mental health trainings, as far as de-escalation. And we even go out to like SWAT calls to where maybe somebody may want to harm themselves or they want to jump off a freeway. They call us in and we go out and we de-escalate. So it works well for us opposed to, it depends. Like I said, you have our team that goes out without law enforcement, but then you have our team, like myself, which go out with law enforcement.
Okay, that's interesting. You said that. You mentioned that you have a team that goes out without law enforcement. Can you tell me more about that? What situations go into that category?
So with that team, they get community calls based on families. So just say, for instance, if you had your family and you noticed somebody in your household that was possibly psychotic or had a history of mental illness, but they didn't need law enforcement because they're not aggressive, but they just need somebody to come out and evaluate them, talk to them, find out, how they're doing. Then you call our psychiatric mobile response team, which will triage the call, make sure it's safe to come out, and then they'll come out. And if the person meets criteria or needs to be hospitalized, they'll make arrangements, they'll find a hospital, and they'll have the ambulance to come and transfer them to the hospital. There's no law enforcement needed in that case. In our cases, we have our patrol officers that run across people in the streets while they're out in the streets. And it could be somebody that could be homeless. It could be somebody that they pull over and they notice that something is not right about this person. So instead of them getting into an altercation with this person because they think it's a crime and this person really have mental illness, they call us. We go out and meet them, and then we evaluate the person. If it is a mental illness, then that kind of have us to hospitalize them opposed to them getting into like an officer involved shooting like there has been in the past and things of that nature.
Okay. Is there an ability? So I'm assuming your organization or department has its own specific phone number and contact information. Is there an ability if somebody dials a 911 operator that they're able to transfer to you guys' department or organization if, they describe to the operator that what they need is not an officer response?
Yes. So what happens if the community calls 911 and the 911 calls are also kind of assessed? If it's urgent, then they call our team, which is whatever area that they're calling from. They call the local MET agency for that area and they send out a MET team, or they send out patrol officers first to make sure it's safe. Then they send out a MET team. So as far as the community that calls in is not a 911, because if I say my neighbor, he's talking to himself and he's doing something that's strange, I'm not going to call 911, but I want to call some type of agency that will come out and evaluate them. Then we have Department of Mental Health, which we give them an 800 number, and they'll dispatch a team out to that address.
Okay. How do you feel about, you mentioned the division between situations where you send out without police, right? You're the mental health workers and the crisis workers. And then you have situations that do. Talk to me about, do you think that any of the breakdown of the higher percentage of situations that you send out with officers, what would it look like if only the workers were sent out without the police officers?
A lot of it could be really dangerous because a lot of our clients that are mentally ill are very unpredictable. And so if you send out an officer that's not trained, I mean, all the officers get trained, but a Met officer has a little more knowledge than just a regular patrol officer. And if they're not trained to really evaluate and assess a client, then it can go bad, as we've seen before in the past. So it helps when you have a Met clinician and a Met officer to go out to kind of see what the signs are, what the symptoms are of a particular client. And then we say, okay, hey, and then for myself, I have a database that I can look the client up in. If, they give me the basic information for the client, and I can look them up in our system and say, hey, yes, this person has a history of mental illness, and I know that they've been hospitalized before. So I know that this person, has a history. And even if they don't have a history, with my knowledge and expertise, I'll know, hey, this person needs to go to the hospital to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. Or it could be some type of substance use issue that they're on. And even if they don't have a history of mental illness, if they are, intoxicated on some type of substances that are making them psychotic, they need to go to the emergency room. So in that case, we'll call the LA Fire Department and transport them to the emergency room to see if that's the case. And then they'll, detox in the emergency room.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's super interesting. The distinction between a normal patrol officer and a Met officer that is probably works in collaboration with you guys and is trained as a team, I'm assuming. I want to talk about the Met program as a whole. How many police departments in Los Angeles County have this program?
So every police department in Los Angeles County is on board with this program, except maybe 2. And one of them is Beverly Hills. We don't have an agreement with them. And another one, which was Manhattan Beach, we just got on board. So maybe Beverly Hills may be the only agency that's not on board with us as of yet. Okay.
Do you want to speak a little bit more on, what might be the holdup in them?
I'm not sure. A lot of times, and I'm not saying that this is the case because this would come from the higher uppers, but a lot of times agencies have their certain way of doing things. And when you collaborate with us, which is a Met team from the Department of Mental Health, we have, an MOU, and we kind of come together on how we would treat certain clients. So if you have an agency that don't want to do that, then they are more than happy or welcome to refuse not to work with us. But we just find that it's better to work together as a team so that will cut down on, again, all the, officer involved shootings, on all the crime against, with officers and the community, especially when it's dealing with mental health issues. Okay.
Yeah. So how does this program, you mentioned that, you guys are with the Department of Mental Health. How does the funding setup look on this? Do police departments pitch in or pay entirely for this program, or do you guys fund this program yourself and you just work alongside the departments, or how does that work?
So the Department of Mental Health funds this program, but what happens is when we collaborate with a local law enforcement team, it's like for them, they have different units. So they just carve out a unit specifically for the mental health. And 9 times out of 10 is 1, maybe 2 officers. And that one person, now different agencies do it different. Sometimes the agencies have it to where their officer rotates every 3 to 5 years. And so that gives everyone a chance. And sometimes they don't, because a lot of them are new. So sometimes they just have one particular officer. But there's a couple of agencies that not only, pay for their officers, they pay for our clinicians. But for the most part, DMH pays for their clinicians and the agency pays for their officers. And we just collaborate and, work together.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think it would be in the positive interest of all parties involved if, changes in that direction might come? If we heard from Dana earlier about how, these police budgets are overinflated. If some of those funds were redirected to programs like this program, do you think that would be a positive change?
I think it's an excellent program, only because a lot of the clients, of course, they don't want to deal with police officers. They don't want to be in a black and white car. So with a lot of our agencies, our officers are not wearing police uniforms, but they're wearing undercover clothing, and we may not be in a black and white car, but they do identify themselves as a Met officer. And the goal is never to go and arrest and detain. The goal is to provide resources and get help. That's our goal. So, of course, every individual that they come across, they have to run them and make sure, they don't have an outstanding warrant or wanted. But for the most part, they're not there to arrest. They're there to get help, to give resources. So once our clients see that, then they're more apt to wanting to deal with them. We develop a rapport. Some of our clients we, talk to over and over again once they trust us, and they say, okay, we do things. We transport them. If they want to go to rehab, we go transport them to rehab. If they want to go to shelters, we transport them to shelters. Some of them we've even linked up with programs like LASA to get them into housing. So that's our goal. Our goal is to get them off the streets, to get them help, and to provide resources for them.
Okay. I know that you work closely with Officer Osorio, or you guys work in the same department. Is there anything to this conversation that we didn't talk about that he might want to talk about, or anything he might add to any of the questions I asked today?
I just know as far as with him, because with the Inglewood program, I work with Inglewood Met. So I work with Inglewood Police Department. So their program just started back in 2016. That's when I started working with them. And he's been the Met officer. And he even likes the idea. It's been very successful. We have, stories of people that we have gotten off the streets. We have stories of people that we have helped. And this is something ongoing. Of course, you have those resistant clients, and that's where they come in, because a lot of times they're unpredictable. And I feel safe working with law enforcement because I've also worked on the PMRT side, and it's been times we triage a call and everything, and we get to the house, and then you feel some type of way, and then the client is very, very unpredictable, and then they go off, and then we have to call law enforcement anyway. So it just depends on the situation, but I feel safe working with law enforcement, especially in, the way that we do it, because like I said, he's an undercover uniform. We're not in a black and white, but when we go out, they are aware that this is an officer, but he's a Met officer, and so I think that as far as with him, he also likes the program as well.
Okay. Guys, it's been super interesting talking to both of you about your distinct programs. I actually have a personal question here, kind of regarding the same thing. Change within the policing structure, but coming from the community. What do you guys think about the idea of having communities only hire or have police officers work communities that have to come from the communities? You guys have any takes on that setup?
I think that...
So it would be basically hiring, unless you are in the community or come from the community, you wouldn't be able to patrol.
Yeah, I definitely get the question. And that's a big question here is residency requirements is should cops come from the city versus Long Island? This is a question in Baltimore where some of the cops come from Delaware. I definitely understand that. And I think that ultimately, having worked with law enforcement for 11 years, and this was actually a question I was going to ask Anika, is people tend to adopt the culture, whether they mean to or not. And the system is rotten, right? It's, there are no really good guys or really bad guys. We all live on a spectrum somewhere, right? And when the system is bad, it almost doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. I mean, the potential to do bad things or be a bad actor is just really too high because it protects, the system will always protect itself. It'll always innovate. You could talk about reform till you're blue in the face, but the system will protect itself and it'll wrap itself around. There's been a bunch of reports now coming out, not just in New York City, but across the country, okay, we're not doing stop and frisk anymore, where you put guys up against the wall and search them. Now they're doing car stops. So it will always protect itself. So while I do agree that there's a lot of benefit, like with Deputy Inspector Terrell Anderson being from Brownsville and having that level of integrity and respect that he has, I also know other cops who are from Brownsville that are pretty brutal. So it's I think it's the system, and I think that we have to restructure the police departments, and I think we have to reimagine public safety so that policing is on part of the ecosystem, not the entire ecosystem.
Okay.
And I was going to ask that to you, Anika, like, how hard is it to maintain the individual culture of the Met workers and even the Met officers? Like, do Met officers get looked down upon by their peers? Like, oh, you're out there doing social work stuff kind of thing. You know, like, what is that like?
Well, actually, a lot of the officers want to come over to our unit.
Because your culture is better.
Right. Because and that's the thing about me. And I think a lot of, the clinicians, because we come and we bring our views, I'm not going to just stand by and say and let you do something that's unethical. If this person doesn't meet criteria, why should we take them to the hospital just so you can get them off the streets? If this person, so they're held accountable, I believe, because they're working with somebody from another department. It's not like, oh, we go with whatever. No, that's it, not for me and a lot of clinicians. It's not like that. They're going to be ethical about it, and you're going to be held accountable if you do something that's not right. So I think with that being said, that, it's enjoyable. They like it. And like I said, a lot of officers want to come work with our unit. They're like signing up like, okay, when is it going to be a rotation? Because they want to come and do what we're doing, because they deal with it anyway, but they don't have the resource. Like, I'm the resource. So when they have to deal with it without the resource, it becomes frustrating. But then if they are able to work with me and then they're able to get the resource, it makes it much more like calming.
That's super interesting. You mentioned, officers trying to get on rotation with the MET program. What's the kind of transferable ratio to that? Because you mentioned anyone who works with you guys have to have their own individual training. So what does that process look like of getting people to become, MET certified or whatever the terminology is?
So now what I'm hearing is that every time an officer goes through the boot camp, when they're first becoming an officer, they have like a quick overview of mental illness. Like, they have a mental illness training. Then once they become an officer, I believe every year it's up to the agency to make sure each officer goes through this either 8-hour or 16-hour mental health training. And that's required now. So Department of Mental Health, we were the ones that was putting on that training. And then also at the time, when Jackie Lacey was the DA, she also had a program to where she was putting on the training for all of the law enforcement. It was a 16-hour training that I was also a part of. I was helping to train law enforcement agencies that had never had it. But now it's a requirement. So not only do they get the 16-hour mental health training a year, then we also provide small trainings throughout that they're welcome to come to. They're not required to come to, but they're welcome. So It's up to the agency, to make sure that their employees are getting the trainings, and we definitely provide the trainings, and also we go through trainings ourselves.
Okay, yeah. So is there anything you guys want to ask me before we wrap up here?
So now, what actually are you doing this for?
So I was put on the National Gen Z and Millennial Community by one of my professors here at the University of Akron. And then I was later contacted by members within this community about this program. And I just think it's something that's important to me. So I wanted to get involved as much as I could. I don't know that there's too much of a description outside. I think it's an important issue. And, I'm all for spreading social media awareness and getting everybody talking about the issue. But I think it takes people like you guys and running programs like you guys to actually enact some of these changes that everybody wants to happen, for the better of all of our communities. But it takes doing things like you guys are doing to, make the real difference. And I definitely want to be a part of that.
I want to thank you for having me as well and, allowing me to talk about, and this is just a small portion of what we do. I know we're going to wrap it up, but just real quick, I want to also make a quick announcement that not only we have what's called the law enforcement agency teams, which before COVID, once a month, all the agencies and their MET teams used to get together for one big meeting, and we would have trainings, and what we would do is see what other agencies were doing in their cities, depending on what was going on. And they would, like either give us a PowerPoint presentation or show a video. And so we were also learning from each other. Like, okay, if one agency has a homeless problem, which is, greater than everyone else's, they'll tell us what they're doing to get their homeless problem resolved. So it was also like a learning thing, a collaboration between all the agencies and the MET team. So that's another good thing that we had, and we will continue that once COVID is all calmed down. But yeah, that was another good thing that we had. So I'm actually the vice president for the LACMET Association, LACMET Association.
Okay. Dana, would you like to shout out any of your coming projects before we sign off here? It's been great talking with you and Annika.
No, I would encourage everybody to visit webuildtheblock.org to look at what we're doing on the ground and what our youth organizers are doing at Crew Count. Follow us on social media. It's Crew Count NYC. Or my social media is all this stuff too, which is Dana_Racklin. And, just grateful for the opportunity. And I hope, if there's a takeaway about anything that I said today, it's the idea of who is an expert.
Yeah.
And who are the authorities on public safety? And, I think that we really have to start shifting the paradigm around the way that we talk and think about expertise and and qualifiers to be experts. Because a lot of people are the experts in public safety in their own communities, and they deserve to be listened to and be taken seriously and be given the resources to take care of their own community.
I love that. I love that a lot.
Thank you.
Being an expert on public safety in one area doesn't make you a public safety expert for everywhere.
Yes.
That. So.
Yes. And show us your activism with how you vote and how you spend your money.
So that's all the time we have for today. This has been Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing. I want to thank Annika and Dana both for joining me today. And thank you, and we will see you in the next episode.